Metro Charter Commission for March 1st, 2022 to order. We have old business, the approval of the minutes of the October 20th, 2021.
Before we do that, I think we have to call the roll. Marty?
Yeah, go ahead and call the roll.
All right, so I'll do the roll call real quick. Marty Kirsch?
Here.
Reed Bornholt?
Here.
Bill Bullock. Donna Drummond?
Here.
Lisa Rudolph?
Here.
Ken Severson?
Here.
David Gepner? Mike Ulmer?
Here.
Ted Raywald?
Here.
Dave Lamberger?
Here.
Brant Kruger?
Here.
Michelle Dowell?
Here.
Rory Coleman Woods? And Gordon Vizecki.
Here.
We have a quorum.
That gives us a quorum, okay. So now we're back to the minute approval of the October 20th, 2021.
Move to approve.
Second. For the discussion, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Adopted. Now we go into new business, election of officers.
Chris, you want to explain your theory?
I can jump in here, Commission. So based on when we last had a meeting, which was October of 2021, basically as the charter reads, you only elect the officers for the remaining part of the year. So what I would recommend you do is you just move to elect the same officers for 2022.
So moved.
Second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Adopted. Summary of the charter amendment process. City attorney will take us through that.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, at our last meeting, as you recall, there was a request by some of the commissioners to get some additional information about the process for amending the charter. So, I believe that you all received a copy of the memo that I put together. And hopefully you've all had a chance to kind of review that ahead of the meeting. I'm not going to read it to you, obviously, but I'll just kind of summarize give you the highlights here and talk to you generally. I'll try to answer any questions if there are any. But essentially, a city charter can be amended in a couple of different ways. And one is amending the charter by proposal, and that can occur either by the commission itself proposing changes to the charter or by receiving a citizen petition to amend the charter. With the proposal approach, those proposal, whether it's suggested by the commission or by a citizen petition, are ultimately sent to the city council, who is then required to put those proposals to a vote of the residents. There really is no discretion there on the part of the council. When a proposal is received, it has to go to an election. Unless it's an unconstitutional proposal, that would be a situation where the council can turn it down. The other way to amend the charter is to do it by ordinance, and that can occur in a couple of different ways. The council itself may propose amendments to the charter by ordinance. And in that situation, what occurs is the council would submit the ordinance proposing amendment to the charter commission, and then you would have a certain amount of time to review the council's proposed ordinance, and then that would get submitted to the voters. The second way to amend the charter by ordinance is for the charter commission to be the one recommending to the city council that the charter be amended by ordinance. And so the process that we're going to go through with respect to the charter review now, and you all received a copy of the initial review of the charter, we're really operating under this particular section here, which is the Charter Commission recommending to the City Council that the charter be amended by ordinance. This is one way of amending the charter without having to put the question on a ballot where the voters vote on it. Residents do have the option of getting involved within 60 days after an ordinance is passed and published. Residents may request a referendum on the ordinance by filing a request with the city clerk. And there are certain requirements relating to what that looks like. There's some requirements for the petition and a certain timeline in which everything has to occur in order for a referendum to take place. So that's a really high-level overview of the information that I included in the memo to you all. And again, really the process that we're looking at for what we're about to undertake falls into Section 2, Paragraph B, which is the Charter Commission recommending. I don't know if there's any questions about the basic process, but that's really a high-level overview of what we're looking at.
Well, any questions at this time?
Want to fix your,
So let's see.
had a extra person.
Oh, that's Rory.
That's Rory. He does that, yeah.
Okay. I'll just make one more comment about the process where the Charter Commission's recommending council. I think the last time we did some more significant changes to the charter was back in 2003. And timeline for the council's review, and ultimately there's also a public hearing that will occur in front of the city council. The timeline for everything begins upon the recommendation that will be made by the. So I believe the process that we followed last time, and I would recommend we do something similar, as a written recommendation to the city. The timeline for having to hold the public hearing and go through the council process. And the other comment I have is just a reminder that using this approach requires unanimous vote of the city council on the changes. So that's one reason it's going to be very important for this body and ultimately for the city council to take its time in looking over these proposed changes and having discussion about it, because we do need unanimous vote of the city council. Forgot to mention that before.
So I don't know if the commission has any additional questions or wants to move on to the next steps, which is actually getting into the reviewing the initial charter commission bylaws and the recommended amendments that we have prepared for this commission.
So let's move ahead.
All right. So everyone should have received from me both the bylaws, the current bylaws of this commission with proposed edits. That's a really colorful sheet where we made a lot of changes. My apologies. Most of those are just sort of moving stuff around and changing fonts and things, so it looks a little bit more intense than it actually is. And we also included a clean version for what we're recommending. What I will bring up is I will bring up the edited version showing the changes. And we can go through this and see if there's any points of discussion that the commission wants to proceed with. Both Mary and I are here to answer any questions. I do think there's a couple of specific spots that we called out in yellow. In this instance, it says alternative language. There's kind of questions that we'd like the commission to sort of dig into or maybe think about a little bit more deeper than us just changing some of the capitalizations. And specifically in this case, on that first page, it's about the annual meeting. I know many of you have experienced some of the challenges of having an annual meeting early January each year. So what we're trying to do is a little bit more flexibility. So try as early as possible, but also sort of don't have it set totally built in for a specific date. Not sure how this commission feels about that, but I do think that we can hear whatever discussion points we want there.
Yeah, that's always been a problem for us, getting a date, and we had a couple of meetings where we couldn't find a quorum. So if we get some flexibility there, it would be. Another question is, how is the 15 members to our group? Is that set by the judge or the state law?
That is, by statute, it can, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here, let's see. You can have anywhere from, so I think Richfield's,
Not as long as I can.
yeah, yes. Verify that though. Regarding the annual meeting, by statute, you're just required to meet once every calendar year. So it doesn't need to be necessarily in January. That's really up to you.
I like the idea of it being specified, even set that it'll be, the third Tuesday, or whatever. And then if we need to make a change, fine. There wasn't a problem until we had a big snowstorm one year. Couldn't get it,
Yeah.
understandably. And then some trouble trying to get it rescheduled. And then pandemic, so understandably we can't meet there. I think for everyone's sake, it's just easier to know that the intention is for the third Tuesday, or I'm pulling out of the hat, but, whatever we specify. Barring, outside circumstances, we will meet on that day. You just kind of know when you plan for it. Instead of waiting and tossing out dates, who can come this day, who can come this day. We're not planning a lunch, outing, it's a meeting. So, plan for it and show up.
So how shall we treat each one of these issues? Should she make a motion or something, or by consensus, or how are we gonna?
That's up to you. I mean, I would suggest maybe just having a discussion and kind of getting a feel for how most of you feel about a specific issue, and then I guess you can either just do it by consensus, or you can do it by motion if you want to. I don't know that it's necessary to have a motion on every single issue, but that's really up to you how you want to do that process.
Instead of getting through all this, would it make sense to just kind of work through it by consensus? And then a motion to approve our collective changes?
And under your proposal, there is flexibility in there.
Yeah, reschedule if, so many circumstances, or however we want to word that. But intend to meet on a specified day.
Just to be clear, are the only real substantive changes the ones that are highlighted in yellow on the clean sheet, and everything else is just a, typesetting formatting issue?
Everything underlined is new or been reorganized. So certainly if there are questions on any of this, that's fair. The highlighted areas were just things that we specifically wanted the commission to talk about, because we just had a question on how we wanted to go. But all of the underlined, the red text that you see, that's all new. It's not particularly controversial or I think objectionable in any way, but it's really just, it's new language. So all of that in section 1 is really new. It's just background, general background. Section 2 deals with meetings, and so we've already talked a little bit about the annual meeting. It would be nice to know kind of how the commission as a whole feels about that, and we can adjust the language there. Paragraph 3 there, we revised the language about special meetings, just to make it more consistent with the notice requirements under state statute for special meetings. And then added some just general language about public meetings and a quorum. The order of business is essentially the same. We just moved it from a different part of the bylaws. Added some language that the order of business can be changed by simple majority vote.
Well, I'll say a lot of the changes are either getting in line with sort of state statutes or kind of best practices that we've seen other cities do.
And it's also just cleaning up and adding a little more clarification in areas. Your bylaws had not been changed since 1980.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's been a long, long time. Periodically tune that document up is a wise thing.
Thought there had been some discussion about the process to become a member or to appoint somebody. Because this past year, we had an issue where people had applied for membership and it got kind of lost in the process, whether it was chief judge's office or what. And I thought there was some discussion that going to have all applications at least processed by the city and sent on to the judge so that they had a record of who had applied and they could monitor the status of these applications better.
Yeah, there has been discussion about that because you're right, that we lost some in the interim, and I think Chris has indicated he started out by sending the document to his office.
Yeah, President Commission, there was kind of a,
Yeah.
just an interim process that I came up with, just that we kind of knew where it was going, just before it would go to the chief judge. And then we didn't know if the chief judge didn't hear anything until something was approved. And you've all gone through the process, you send the chief judge something, they send you something, then you send something back. I think what maybe occurred in that time was there was a turnover in the chief judgeship, so then whatever was in the, what wasn't waiting kind of disappeared into some file somewhere. That's something we can have additional discussions on. I know that I sent out a preliminary sort of synopsis of kind of what I would like to see the process on. We can talk about that. You know, right now, we can talk about it later. I can kind of reformat that process and whatever we're open with. I think basically what our intention was to have a little bit more involvement so we know we could find that application easy and we kind of knew what was going on with the chief judge's office.
But I don't think we need to do it right now, but I think the topic should be addressed. I mean, you could have, you know, 7 people applying for 5 positions, and without somebody keeping track of it, we don't know, you know, is the judge going to decide which of those 5, which 5 of the 7? You know, no means to, as such, you know, track the process, applications. I think, you know, just for clarification, you know, worth looking at down the road.
We're still on topic of the annual meeting.
Yeah, that's,
Basically, what she's proposing is we move our annual meeting at the end of your alternate, or as soon thereafter, if circumstances.
but keep it on the specific designated date.
Yeah.
Okay. Second Tuesday in each January.
And if we and make that date work, so we have some flexibility.
That's fine, if that's the consensus, I don't know.
I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Do you wanna check with him?
It's a little hard to hear online, but sounds like what you were going with is picking a date, but then going with language closer to the second alternative language there of picking a date, but still having it, the option of having it thereafter. I would be in support of something like that rather than the primary language there of having it once a year. As a world-class procrastinator myself, I would see a lot of meetings happening at the end of December if that was the case. So I would lean more towards the language in the alternative language.
Yeah, Brant, what we're talking about here is basically using the current language, but appending it with, with modifying it, basically shooting for the second Tuesday in January, but then adding the codicil here about, if, commission needs to, basically allowing, putting a provision in to move it if circumstances required.
Sounds good.
They call me boom boom. So,
Yeah, it is really helpful when you guys speak clearly and loudly and enunciate, especially with the masks on. Thanks.
let me ask a question on page 2 regarding quorum. It talks about a majority being 8 of qualified and acting members. I've been on another commission, city attorney, where we weren't at full, we weren't fully seated as a commission. There were less than the 15 people. And in this case, I think I don't recall the exact numbers, but by having a requirement of 8 for a quorum, if you had 7 members, 7 open seats, you had to really shoot for everybody being on there. Is it permittable and advisable to make the quorum greater than 50% of the active membership of the commission? So in the event that we had, for example, 2 open seats
Right.
today, that the quorum tonight would be 7 instead of 8.
Yes, and I think a simple way to do that would just be to remove the number 8.
Okay,
Language. Because then it would say a majority of qualified and acting members.
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
So just remove the number 8. Because that's a good point.
how about on the web? Any concerns with that?
No, I think that sounds good.
Okay. I had another one. On page 3 under officers, why am I secretary treasurer when I have no access to no funds? Should that title simply just be secretary and not secretary treasurer? Or am I missing a checkbook?
That could have been just drafting error on my part.
So that was the original
Sure.
title of that position. My guess is that's a hangover from when they were pulling, the charter together, and the person was probably the person writing checks to the town.
Okay.
So, you could just move to make that just secretary and strike the treasurer aspect of it, unless there's a checkbook around and you want to know what's going on with that.
Just look around.
Okay.
That, could we get that removed?
Concerns for those on WebEx? All right.
So nobody on this commission has duties that,
We have access to no funds,
okay.
so, or we have no access to funds.
Got it. Okay. And as long as we're on that section of officers, there's another section there that's highlighted in yellow. And I'm gonna try to read this tiny print here. So before December 31st of each year, the secretary must submit to the chief judge of the district court the chair's report outlining the activities and accomplishments of the commission. Language that I've added, it's consistent with what state statute says. I don't know, is that something that has been done?
We haven't done that in the past.
Okay.
We haven't had any activity besides me.
Okay, nothing to report.
It'd be a really short report.
Who's the chair? Makes reference to a chair, but we don't have a
All
chair.
right, that should say president. And so, because this is required by statute, I would recommend we leave it in, but then if there's no report to be made, but.
Could be a report saying that, just so it's
Right.
specified.
Does the wording then need to change? Because it's saying here that the secretary must submit to the chief judge. You know, if nothing happens, do we just send in a blank sheet of paper? Or is that a hard requirement in the case of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to check the statutory language. I think the way the bylaws reads is verbatim
Okay.
from what the statute says.
If it's required, it's required.
So,
And
um,
we can reach out to the chief judge's office and see what other cities provide, and then work staff and support this commission.
Well, the last sentence, provide a copy to the city clerk, and the city clerk may provide the report to the judge on behalf of. So should our policy, depending on statute, we submit to the clerk, even if it is just no report? And the clerk decides whether that's worthy of
Okay.
sending on or not.
right, and we can, as Chris said, we can check with the chief judge's office too to see if they want to get a report like that or not.
Right.
We can certainly follow up on that.
It's a small formatting thing, but on page 3 here, numbers 2 and 4 are underlined. Now it says, election of officers and vice president. On the
What,
same
I
page.
see what you mean, yeah. Anybody, on the web have any comments? I see a couple of hands raised.
Yeah, my hand is up just because it's mainly a clarifying question. Bottom of page 2, are we actually using the full Roberts rules, or are we using a simplified Sturgis rules from a parliamentary perspective? Because if we're going to use Roberts rules, I don't think Marty's asking for discussion quite enough.
That's a very good question, and, adopting parliamentary procedural rules is not a requirement at all. I think it can be helpful at times if there's any question or issue that arises at a meeting or arises out of a procedure that was followed. But you're certainly not required to adopt any certain parliamentary procedures. It can be Robert's rules, it could be Sturgis, the city council uses Sturgis rules. So maybe there's a reason to be consistent. I guess that's up to the body, but Robert's rules can be overly complicated and sometimes unnecessary for smaller groups. Very large assemblies use Robert's rules, and it's often not really, in my humble opinion, not really often necessary for smaller bodies such as this, but.
Well, I would think since the city council uses Sturgis, that it would be consistent.
Yeah, I agree.
In my view, Sturgis is easier to understand, and just a lot less complicated.
And you've got it entered into the system, so you can pull up any problem we have.
This is Brant. What about just inserting some language, so changing it to Sturgis rules, but then also inserting some simple language to the effect of at the discretion of the chair, so that, or the president in this case, sorry, giving them the discretion to kind of lock down as necessary, or keep things flowing as necessary. I would be comfortable with language to that effect.
One way to address that might be, if I may make a suggestion, is the body at any time can waive procedural rules. And so I think by a majority vote, if you want to follow a different procedure, you have the discretion to do that at any time. So I think that, or it could be left up to the chair if you wanted to do it that way. But I have seen in bylaws with other organizations that you just have a requirement, or you allow by a majority vote or by a 2/3 vote, that you can simply waive the procedural rules. That might be one way to address that. If I'm understanding your issue.
Commissioner Drummond also had a comment.
This is back under special meetings. I was just curious why the change has reducing the number of members who can call a special meeting from 5 to 2. Is that consistent with state statute?
It is consistent with state statute with respect to city councils. So you can certainly have a different requirement if you would like, but this is just a proposal. So, but the reason for that was to make it consistent to what, how a city council can call a special meeting, but it's not something that you are required to do.
Yeah, I guess I don't have strong opinion one way or the other, but I was just curious why the change.
That's the rationale for it, but again, certainly something that you can discuss if you'd rather keep it with the original number that works too.
But if you don't have a full commission, if the commission can go down to 7 or 8, 2 good number. So it all depends upon how full the commission is.
I guess I'm fine with 2.
You're not pushing for more meetings, are you, Donna?
No.
Making sure.
Gotta make sure you have a report, no?
I like turning in blank sheets of paper.
I have a question. Section 3 used to be duties of officers, and it basically went away with the exception of one line item that is now orphaned. It did not get become number 8 for the current Section 3, and it did not become part of the committees.
That's just.
So it either needs a different number or it needs a heading.
I apologize for that. I think that's just a formatting error. I believe that should be part of Section 3, and the numbering will be consecutive there. So we have paragraphs 1 through 7, and then we have 8, and I believe that should be number 9. So I think that was just a formatting mistake. But thank you for pointing that out. If I could go back to, I think it was Commissioner Kruger's about the procedural rules. Does that, just for clarification so I know, does it make sense to the group to have a provision to waive parliamentary procedural rules on a majority vote of the body, or leaving that up to the chair? Of that.
And majority vote, those present.
Head nods are questions up there? Yes, okay.
For what it's worth, I would actually be fine with the default being off and then only turned on as necessary for debate and things like that. But I tend to be a little less strict when it comes to those kinds of things.
I think it's one of those things that it's good to have to rely on it when you need it, but it's probably very rarely going to ever come into play. I think in my whole time as a city attorney so far, I only had one parliamentary procedural dispute over something where we had to go and look at the rules to figure out how to resolve it. So those kinds of questions and issues don't come up very often. Are there any other questions on the proposed changes? Anybody have? Hopefully, everybody thinks it's an improvement to the original bylaws. Yeah. Okay.
It cleans them up a lot.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So you're gonna come back with another copy with all the
Yes.
additions and corrections?
I think it makes sense for me to make the revisions that we've talked about tonight, and then at the next meeting, I want to give everybody the opportunity to review the changes, actually
No,
adopt the new bylaws. Yeah, that makes sense.
That sounds great. That's,
Okay.
that's our plan too.
Okay.
because we probably aren't gonna do this for a number of years again.
Maybe 40 more.
Well, I will say that I added some language, and you can tell me if you want to leave it in or not. If I can find out where it is here. I added some language that the bylaws would be reviewed every 2 years. That doesn't mean you need to do anything.
Oh, yeah. Section 1, number 6.
Yes. The commission will review the bylaws at least once every 2 years and may be amended by a majority vote of the commission. That can be changed if you want to make it a longer period of time. I just think it's a good practice to take a look at your bylaws on a, somewhat regular basis.
Yeah, see, unless you had brought it up, for another 10 years without looking at it.
So somebody just needs to be able to track that.
So I think having some time frame is wise.
Hands up on
Two
the screen there.
is a good number?
I think so. 3 is probably fine too. I think it'd be nice to have it happen at least once in every term. If you do 3 years, you're gonna hit, no matter what the rotation is, everyone will get that process at least once in their term.
I think there's a couple of hands up too on the web.
Just real. Sorry, I don't know if I unmuted. The nominating committee language at the bottom of page 4, there's a note in the margin, Mary, you asking if it's actually the way it occurs.
Oh,
This is my second meeting, but so far it's not the way it's occurred.
Yeah, I had the same comment.
okay. Yes, I forgot about that comment, and we forgot to highlight it, so that's why I missed it there. So the way this reads now, in November of each year preceding the election of officers at the annual meeting, the commission shall elect a nominating committee of 3 members. The nominating committee who shall report at the annual meeting the nomination of 1 candidate for each office. Written reports of such nomination shall be mailed to each member at least 20 days before the annual election. Now, this is from your original, with a few tweaks. This is original language, so I don't know if this just needs to be changed or if it's a practice that sounds like maybe, I don't know if it's been done in the past or not, but.
I think the written reports may have happened during the Truman administration, but I don't recall that that's happened in the last, in my involvement with this commission.
Not mine.
Well, it almost looks like the requires a meeting in November to select the nominating committee. Is that right?
It does sort of imply that, for sure.
Well, except that it talks about, in the section about officers in the executive committee, that, officers of the committee, were able to, where I read it, would basically be able to establish, in this case, a nominating committee without having a full meeting of the commission. The wording's a little clumsy, I'll grant you, Donna, you're right, that it kind of suggests that there should be a November meeting. Well, you really want meetings, don't you?
Well, maybe it should say the executive committee shall select a nominating committee.
Or even just to say, at the annual meeting, there should be nominations for any officers and the commission will vote. Because then you're doing it in the moment of the meeting. Unless somebody's going to be running a campaign where they want to get their content out there to convince folks that they should be selected. It really seems like it could happen as a self-contained matter within the annual meeting, instead of having some event that happens months prior and then a mailing that hasn't been happening. I don't know that it's good practice to memorialize something we aren't doing.
Right.
When, in most years, there isn't any work to be done. So why create more for the sake of creating work? Do it all at the annual meeting, as we've been doing. It's not this late, and we vote on it right there. Examinations, done.
So the language would be that the executive committee would put forth nominations at the annual.
Actually, Mary, I think we don't need this section at all, because the earlier section that describes the election of officers at the annual meeting fully addresses it, although it doesn't, go into the detail about nominations for those offices, I don't believe. I'm toggling back and forth between screens. Because in section 2 of officers, it describes
Yes.
the majority vote. So I don't think the nominating committee is necessary at all.
Right. I agree. I think we can strike that whole paragraph.
Strike nominated committee, item 2, and then strike any mention of nominating committee from paragraph 1. There may be a need for a committee to deal with some particular topic, and so that you'd still want that language there that the president in consultation can form that committee, but we don't need to reference a nominating committee that's not going to exist.
Good,
I agree.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up. I forgot about that comment. in the-
Yeah, and by extension, then number 3 below, I just noticed number 3 says that nominations from the floor are always appropriate. But if we're reverting to that officers and elections section, I don't think we need that one either.
Yep. Okay.
Or we can move it.
Make it part of item 2.
Yeah, it could just be moved to the section 2 under officers. I mean, you want to keep that option. I think maybe makes some sense.
Don't see any additional questions on the line.
document and Red, we've got that taken care of now? And
I'm
we'll
sorry?
bring it back with corrections.
Yes.
Okay. Everybody agree with that for see the final?
Yep.
Okay.
We need to review the commission's bylaws.
We just did that, Marty.
Um,
Next step.
Review the city charter and recommendations. Comments?
President Commission, much like the bylaws, you have in this packet both the version showing the changes that we are recommending and a clean version with the changes basically in play. There's a number of items again that we have highlighted, or number of items that we have highlighted within the city charter, specifically with yellow that we think should be points of discussion within the commission. A lot of, much like the bylaw report, a lot of the other recommendations are just bringing this more in line with state statute or kind of implementing best practices. Just pull that up too for the folks online.
So the charter hasn't been looked at for many years probably.
That is correct. In 2003, and could put together a little history, a memo with some of the history that right now that could have maybe been helpful to you, but the last time there were any real substantive changes, charter was in chapters that were amended. So it has been a number of years. Actually, I take that back. In 2003 and then again in 2013, a handful of changes. Not many, but there were a few changes made in 2013. Dealing with one change I recall had to do with the contract authority for the city manager.
Yeah.
If you recall that, changing the level of authority for the city manager. So what we did, I know this is a lot of information. So it's really up to you. We can go through the whole thing tonight. We can, of course, do it as much as you want. We could cover just some of the questions. I'm happy to do this however you'd like to. I know that getting this group together is sometimes challenging, so, but this is also going to be a process, and it will require your input. Ultimately, we'll have to meet with the city council, probably in a work session, to get their input, and there might be some back and forth, there might be several meetings, so we need to be somewhat patient with this whole process. That may take some time for us to get through. I think that, again, high-level overview, a lot of the proposed edits are, some are housekeeping, cleanup type things, some are bringing the charter in line with current state law, particularly with respect to some of the election language that you probably noticed. And then I've added some language in a couple sections that we're proposing for discussion to just get some initial. I'll leave it up to you how you want to proceed as far as just going through and each section or high points or whatever you'd like to do.
When this comes before the council, does it have to be a unanimous vote?
It does.
So that's why we have to have a study session to make sure we're
Correct. So once we get through the process, we get feedback, we're in agreement, we've talked to the city council, then what I will do is prepare the necessary ordinances and prepare a written recommendation for the president of the commission to provide to the city council. And gets the time clock running for when you also will need to hold a public hearing for all this. We're a ways out from that happening, but that will be how the process will play out.
All right, what's the wish of the group?
Question is, do you propose doing the bylaws separately than the charter changes then?
Yes, the bylaws do not have to be acted upon by the
That's
city
just our
council.
recommendation?
That's just something that you,
I didn't know if that needed their approval. Then the other thing is, how far do you want to go through this today?
I'm willing to stay here as long as you need me.
I'm gonna have to tap out at 8.
That was fine.
Oh, okay.
You want to just go on a timeline? As far as we can on a time proposal?
Well, it's obvious that we're gonna have to have one meeting.
We could, it's totally up to you. We could start with, if everybody's had an opportunity to look through this, and I don't know that everybody has, but maybe we can start with questions. What, things that you saw that you had questions about, or, want to know more about. And a lot of this is pretty straightforward, but some of it will require discussion.
One thing that caught my attention, section 3.01, council meetings. Newly elected members of the council will assume their duties in the first regular special meeting of the council in January, following regular election. The special election, though, to specify when they assume their position.
If I recall, Lisa, from my reading, that actually shows up in the special election portion.
Okay, I tried to find it and I missed it then. I was trying to.
But so Mary, I did note though, there's a number of instances where there are defined terms being used that aren't properly capitalized.
Yes.
Just for example, even in 1.03, city should be capitalized in the second line. And there's several instances where council member, when it's used as a defined term, the member part is not capitalized. And throughout the document, there are a number of instances where city is being used as the defined term, but it's not capitalized.
I appreciate you pointing that out, and I should have included in my comments to start this out that I know that. And that is something that I didn't go all the way through this document and figure out where all that needs to happen.
Yeah, and not all of it was in the suggested changes. There were existing instances of improper use of defined terms or not properly using defined terms.
Yes. And as I was reviewing this entire document and, going paragraph by paragraph, that jumped out at me too. I'm just wondering procedurally, I'm thinking maybe that's stuff that we can just clean up without having to put it in the ordinance. Because to me, that's just clerical cleanup that I think we should be able to do without having formal action on it. But yes, I agree.
Yeah. President Council, that was my expectation too, is that all those general cleanup stuff we could just make and not have it be a problem.
Right.
Commissioner Drum.
Is the main change we need to talk about what happens with special elections? If I kind of remember some past meetings where that was talked about, what other cities do, and am I remembering that right? Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Yes, you are correct.
So I wonder if it makes sense to ask for comments or questions about the rest of the document. And then after everybody's done with that, then just focus on the special election section.
Or is there a way to pull out what's required by state statute? What do we need to change in line with state statute? How much to discuss there? We have to do that. Get those parts done.
Correct, and
Clean up what we can,
you'll
that-
see in a number of sections where I've stricken language about certain timelines for special elections, and just because now that state statute says you have to hold, you can only hold special elections on certain dates. In a number of the sections I added as authorized by state law, or on the first date as authorized by state law. That was language that was added to several sections to address that issue. Because there have been, in the more recent special elections that you've held, we ran into problems trying to comply with some of the timing requirements in the city charter because of the change in state statute. There's a catch-all provision in state statute that says basically, if you do your best, that's good enough. I'm paraphrasing, but it's better for the charter, I think, to have that, changes that we're proposing to address. Don't have to worry about the kind of struggle to comply with those impossible deadlines.
Is the interim order section, is that a new statute? Is that because of statutory? Is that to come in line with other cities? It just seems like a substantial ability to dodge the public comment period, specifically section 3.065.
Yes, this is new proposed language, and I can explain the rationale behind potentially adding this. City councils already have the ability to adopt interim ordinances under state statute, so it wouldn't necessarily be required to include this. One of the reasons for including it is to address the effective date. Under your charter now, ordinances aren't effective until 30 days after publication, okay? And so, in the past, when the city council has adopted an interim ordinance, which is an ordinance putting a pause on, for example, issuing development permits, if they want to study an issue, or issuing certain kinds of licenses, cities can put a pause and adopt a moratorium on it by adopting an interim ordinance. So the practical problem that has come up is that because the ordinance isn't effective for 30 days, it would allow someone to be able to apply for that license, or basically do what the city council wants a pause on while we let that 30 days run. This would allow an interim ordinance to go into effect right away, rather than having to wait that 30-day period. What we've been doing to try to not get around it, but to try to address that issue, is when the council has adopted an interim ordinance, we've also had them adopt a resolution at the same time, because resolutions go into effect right away. The issue with that is that resolutions aren't really enforceable by law, so if someone were to challenge that, it may not hold up. I've talked with community development staff about this issue, and they would be supportive of something like this, so that council could adopt an interim ordinance. And if you note in section 3.09, we've added interim ordinance to emergency ordinances as being effective immediately upon passage. So that was a long-winded explanation, but that's the main main reason for the proposed change.
And is there a reason why those interim ordinances don't have a simultaneously existing obligation to act to remedy the issue? Essentially, creating the interim ordinance provision allows multiple ordinances to be passed, whether justified or not, without any comment, without a delay for effectiveness, and without an obligation to go back and revisit the issue to undo the interim nature of the ordinance.
Well, interim ordinances by their nature and by their terms are temporary and they expire. And so they cannot be indefinite. So the city is required under any interim ordinance to take steps to study whatever issue it is that they want to study and to take action. And there's time limits under statute for how long an interim ordinance. And so by their very nature, they're temporary and there's certain obligations of the city to do something once an interim ordinance is adopted.
That expiration be included here.
Well, the details about interim ordinances are covered in state statute. I think we have to keep in mind as a charter, this is a very sort of high-level governing document. So we're often not getting into the nitty-gritty details of any specific area in the charter. So that's one of the reasons we're keeping it a little more general. We could potentially add references in the charter to the timelines under state law. That's the rationale behind the proposed language.
But if the interim ordinance ability is already present by state statute, as is the expiration and the temporary nature of it, why include it at all?
It's mainly to allow for the option of having the interim ordinance be effective immediately. And maybe there's a way to do that in a more general sense, but the primary issue is that the city staff would prefer to be able to have interim ordinances go into effect right away without having to wait through. Because it aids in their planning process.
That's fine, but I'd like to see the ending in there too, not just, yes, by definition, it's interim, it's temporary, but if it's, you've got to be working on and studying it, well, we're still studying, we're still working on that. How long does that go?
Well, one of the issues with putting a deadline in the charter is that each will be of a different length. City staff may believe they only need 3 months to study an issue. So the moratorium under the interim ordinance will only be for 3 months. Sometimes they need a year. So it's difficult to put a timeline on. Now, by state law, they can't exceed 12 months. There's certain situations where it can be longer, but every situation.
So does the ordinance itself then have its own date?
Yes, it
Okay.
does.
Okay.
Ordinance will have its own expiration date. Usually gives the council the option to extend it, but it will otherwise just expire on its own terms.
Questions from the folks on the web?
I just want to say that I'm very much supportive of this change. I was the planning director in St. Paul, and interim ordinances are a very important tool to sort of pause things so that city staff can study an issue and bring some recommendations to the elected officials.
I'd just say the flip of that is it really undercuts people's reliance on the existing planning and zoning. So when somebody wants to make a development on their property from a commercial development perspective, we see what happened at Vets Park where there was a panicked, oh, wow, we didn't plan for that. Let's throw the interim ordinance up. Let's throw the moratorium up. And then essentially you've got a private property owner who is hamstrung in their ability to redevelop their parcels.
I guess I would argue that in that case, there was a pretty big issue to kind of figure out. And so taking a little time to do that made sense, in my opinion.
And, those are all valid points. I think just to keep in mind that this isn't allowing the city to do anything it doesn't already have the authority to do under state statute. What we're really addressing here again is when an interim ordinance will be effective. And from a planning perspective, again, staff's preference would be, if we want to use this tool, we'd like to have the ordinance go into effect right away so that we can use the tool effectively. That's really the issue. The authority to adopt an interim ordinance is already there, and councils have it as a tool at their discretion now. So this is really just a way to address that effective date issue.
3.065, when it appears to me that 3.09 already addresses that when these take effect.
And that is a good point, and perhaps another way we could approach this is somewhere though we would have to define what an interim ordinance is. And I think that the addition of 3.065 was a way to say, here's what an interim ordinance is, and then in 3.09 we're including one type of ordinance that can go into effect.
Are interim ordinances defined by state law?
They are, yes.
So in 3.09, you could say, interim ordinances per Minnesota statute so-and-so, and then continue on. You wouldn't need 3.065.
That's certainly one way we could do it.
Or is this just an easier reference point?
It is, it's helpful in the sense that it provides a short description of the interim ordinance. That's also covered in state statute, so if we refer to the state statute, it's just a matter of somebody having to then refer back to the state law rather than having it.
And the charter is easier.
Well, for ease of reference, it's right there.
But if someone
right.
was questioning something, this would be.
Either way, you have to go to a website and look it up. So, yeah.
We do have less documents than the state statute.
That's true. State statutes are available online as well, so they're.
I would be in favor of amending 3.09 to reference state statutes and the removal of 3.065.
That would have the added advantage of allowing for the charter to not have to be amended in the event that state statute changes for interim ordinances.
Good point.
I can make that change if that's.
So I agree on that.
Seems reasonable, yeah.
The other items in the document that we need to look at?
If we want to just talk about the new sections that I added, something I found in another city charter that another city that has recently gone through this process, section 3.13 on electronic signatures. Not highly controversial, I assume, but it addresses a question that comes up.
Good to bring in.
Anyone have any problems with adding that?
Might just be the version that I'm using, but I'm not actually seeing the new language. All I see is a header that says 3.13 electronic signatures. But that might be on my end. If it's there somewhere, I'll look at it on another machine.
I can read it to you if you'd like, Brand.
If it's super short, yeah, go for it.
The city may establish policies and procedures in accordance with law to allow for the use of electronic or facsimile signatures by anyone authorized to sign documents on behalf of the city and for the acceptance of documents signed electronically.
Sounds reasonable.
And I know you're correcting them, Mary, but I can't resist the compulsion to point out that neither of the instances of city are capitalized.
I got the point, Gordon. Yeah, the whole thing needs to be cleaned up.
Mary, can you talk about 13.14? Last page.
Oh, yes. Happy to. So, this language, and just a comment first, just on the placement of this. I checked in with the city manager on this because she was reviewing chapter 7 of the charter, which deals with finance. I wanted her input on that. There is a reference in section 7 to public expenditures. So if this is something that the commission decides it would like to add, we would likely move it to section 7, as it's a little bit more appropriate just in terms of placement. But the 7.01 to be exact. So the rationale behind this proposed language is, so cities, as you know, are only allowed to expend funds for public purposes. And for public purposes that are authorized by state statute. Now, that's very clear for statutory cities. Ridgefield is not a statutory city or charter city, obviously. So charter cities have a little bit more flexibility because you have a charter, and so you are able to buy other areas where funds may be expended that aren't explicitly covered by state laws. We've, actually, our office, we represent a number of cities, and we've had a number of conversations with the state auditor's office about this issue, going back and forth about can charter cities provide additional authority in their own charters for public expenditures? How does the state auditor feel about that? And I think we've finally gotten some agreement or consensus from them that charter cities may provide additional authority in their charters relating to public expenditures. But the primary, I think, reason for potentially including something like this is it just gives a little bit more, it gives some broader authority in certain areas that aren't specifically United States statute. For example, treaty celebrations, things like Red, White, and Blue Days or PennFest. Technically, the city can't, they can work with other groups like your Red, White, and Blue Days, the committee. The PennFest has its own group that raises funds, but the city itself is limited in being able to expend funds to help pay for those kinds of community celebrations. That's just one example where state law doesn't cover that type of thing. And so you'll see in the language here that we've added some specific authority for that type of thing, including community celebrations. I have to look at it on my screen because I can't read this tiny print on the paper. Expenditures relating to international, cultural, and economic development programs, community events, festivals, and celebrations. And those kinds of things aren't specifically identified in state statute, but you could, as a charter city, authorize expenditures for those kinds of events or activities.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition.
And I know a number of other charter cities that have added this type of language to their charters recently.
We've dealt with the state auditor, so.
And we have, and they've sort of agreed that they're not going to argue with us if we have charter cities who include this kind of language and shouldn't get questioned as far as expenditures that maybe fall into these categories.
So you have, there are expenditures now for these categories. Help done by committees outside the city then? Like employee recognitions?
No, not for those things. I was, the example was related to the community events, festivals. So these other items, employee benefits, employee recognition, those things, there is general authority under state statute for those. And so we wouldn't necessarily have to call that out in the charter. I think we're just trying to be.
Anybody object to adding that charter?
Just take the authority of those committees away on expenditures or anything?
No, it would just provide additional authority.
Supplement it if it's needed?
Yep, exactly.
Is anybody opposed to adding that?
I was just moving, I can't hear very well with this machine over here, so.
Well, we're not taking action on these changes this evening, is that correct, Mary?
No, this is all just discussion at this point.
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
And at some point, we'll get a new document.
Yes, yes. I'll revise this as we go,
Okay,
and, you know, we may or may not get through all this tonight, but,
Sure.
I'll revise it as we go.
Okay.
Back.
Capitalize all the Cs.
What's that? Yes,
Capitalize all the Cs.
work on the capitalization. That might be the last thing I do.
guess what Gordon does for a living?
Speaking of that, 10.02. Doesn't the city grant exclusive franchises to, for example, Comcast as the cable services provider? It's limited for a term. It's not a perpetual, but it is an exclusive franchise granted by the city.
Well, but I don't think there's any prohibition against other franchise.
And I'm just reading the language as proposed. No perpetual or exclusive franchise may be granted by the city, period. But in this case, it is an exclusive franchise for the operation and maintenance of, and the ability to extract profits from the cable, the coaxial cable infrastructure.
I don't know if it's the intent, though, for it to be.
It's more of an ask than it is a, hey, we shouldn't do this. I was under the impression that we were already doing it for cable and telecom.
Right, and I think it so happens that there is only one for certain areas. So I think this language is just intent that, that there's a prohibition on making, on making.
The way I take it is you can't have it a perpetual exclusive. You may have, an exclusive one, but it can't be perpetual, so you need to take the word "or" out of that sentence. May give somebody an exclusive franchise for, say, 5 years or 10 years.
But there's always the option to enter into additional.
So when the city signed with Comcast for Comcast to be the cable provider, it wasn't an exclusive, like a secondary company can come and start putting wires between poles.
Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the terms of the franchise. But to my knowledge, it's not exclusive.
And that might be true.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
I'm only asking because it doesn't ever seem that any community has more than one provider. You either get Comcast or you get whoever the other cable company is. Where if it were an option, aside from a municipal utility, like if the city wanted to stand up its own, city Wi-Fi network, aside from that, I'm not aware of any community in the country that has more than one, which just leads me to believe that these are exclusive within that geography.
Well, that's a good, I'll flag that to follow up on it and look at the terms of the current franchises and also talk with the cities.
Any other section you need to deal with? Anything, Mary, that?
Yeah, I was just kind of paging through.
Just for giggles, Gordon, I looked it up. It's a non-exclusive franchise. Provisions of this non-exclusive franchise to provide cable service within the city. And it's a period of 10 years set in 2012. At least that's what I found.
Yeah.
Googling.
Time for me to get out some spools of wire.
Please do.
One interesting change, I don't know if you guys noted this in your review, but in section 2.06, dealing with the powers of the mayor, original language in that section essentially allows the mayor to take over the police department in certain of emergency. And so this issue actually came up in another city, another charter city, dealing with situation where it became a big problem. And the proposed language is a way to make that more of a collaborative process between council, mayor, city manager, police chief, and fire chief as part of emergency response, rather than leaving the power with the mayor to. That probably may never happen in the city of Ridgefield, but a real issue in another city, and so I wanted to highlight that change. Talk about it or had any concerns about it.
No, I think that's a very good adjustment.
What other city that was?
That was in Brooklyn Center. Not, it's public information.
Oh, yeah.
So. I don't know if anybody has questions on the changes to the section elections, but that's one area where in section chapter 4, try to add some consistency about notices for the various types of elections. I think it's fairly straightforward, but I don't know if anybody had any comments on where the posting notices of the primary election elections. Just to make those consistent.
That's just getting us in conformity with state law, right?
Yeah, well, this is actually something that staff pointed out because there was inconsistency how notice was being provided. One place it was in a public place, in another section it was the publication, another section was on the website, so we just made it consistent.
questions from people on the web about the election stuff?
The other sections that we want Mary to go over with us?
I know we've kind of been jumping around a little bit, so sorry about that. Chris, I don't know if you want to maybe jump to section.
What section was that? I wasn't able to hear.
Section 9 on eminent domain. This is primarily just a lot of cleanup kind of language. I looked at a number of other city charters that have identical sections. And the reason for striking a lot of language in this section is basically condemnation or eminent domain process is very driven by state statutes. So I just felt a lot of this procedure and I looked at a number of other city charters where those are consistent with what we see. So it really was just eliminating some of the details, like when an award has to be paid, or things like that. That's all governed by state law, and eminent domain action, you have to follow the state's process anyway. So that was the reason for striking some of those provisions, and that's.
What about easements? That got scratched, I don't see anything that.
Well, it really is covered under the phrase any property up above. So the city may acquire by purchase, gift, condemnation, or other lawful means any property. That includes easements for any purpose. So this language, in my mind, was just a little bit confusing because it was referring to certain types of and acquire property for really covered under that phrase.
Would it be more correct to say, to Ken's point, any property or property right?
Sure, we could add that language. I think that's a helpful clarification.
Because then that would potentially cover fleet leases and other expenditures, not just real property.
Right, correct. Yeah, I like that change.
Additional comments from the commission members on the web?
Chris, could you go to section 13?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize for jumping around here. The change in section 13.01 is just to allow for notices electronically. That's just up with loud forms of notice. And then there are a couple of sections, provisions in chapter 13 that we're striking. If you scroll down, We can go past that. 13.07, we just felt this was no longer necessary. Because it has to do, I think this must have been original language, which said the present officers of the city shall continue in their respective offices, basically, until the charter's government's been set up. So we didn't think we needed that language anymore. And then in section 13.10, relating to pending condemnations and assessments, again, I think that was a carryover from when the charter was first being felt was unnecessary at this point. So I just wanted to point those out. The reason for doing it. I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover, but I'm happy to address other questions or issues if anybody has any.
Anyone additional questions for Mary?
I got a question. There's an interesting article in the Sun Current recently about a new bar tap room that opened. And in that article, they commented that it took them quite a while to get it open because they had to get a revision to the city charter to permit that type of a business. I know the planning commission has spoken with some places before that have expressed a similar interest in Richfield. I was wondering, I didn't see anything in our charter that would prohibit that.
Liquor licensing is not addressed in the city charter. That's governed by city code. Process, not exactly sure which establishment or issue you're. Oh, there was a recent establishment that opened that I believe there were some issues. There was a minor change made to city to allow for one establishment to open a second establishment in the city. So that might be what you're talking about, but.
It's whatever was in the Sun Current.
Okay. Yeah, it didn't involve the charter though.
It was Bloomington.
Oh, in
It was in Bloomington.
Oh.
And their charter had to be changed in order for them
Oh.
to establish that business in Bloomington.
Oh.
I'd hate to see us be in a position where we have things in our charter that would prohibit businesses from wanting to come in here.
Got it. Oh, you know what, now that's ringing a bell, because I'm pretty sure that I read something about that. I'll have to go back and refresh my memory on what that was about. Yeah, that's a good point, I can look into that.
I read about it. We'll confirm it's not in our charter. Make sure it doesn't limit that. Read it today, so I'm kicking myself.
Any other questions for Mary before we up today? Thank you very much, Mary. You have done a good job in this.
So I will work on another version of this, incorporate the changes, some of the other housekeeping items, Gordon, that we talked about, and
I may email you a few others, Mary.
that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to hear from individual, I mean, obviously you all have to come to a meeting to talk to each other, but if you have individual comments or questions, feel free to, or you can email Chris and we can make sure I get the questions.
Yep.
Back actually, so that you're in the loop.
Good, yeah, feel free to email me and everything that is in over, I'll send over to Mary.
So the charter commission is different, we could congregate with one another, open meeting laws, does that affect us?
Yes. You can't,
Maybe we can.
right, in the meeting you can, two of you want to have a conversation, that's fine, as long as it's not quorum, but,
We can't allow them to go to Frenchman and keep talking.
right, exactly.
Some of us have to go to Sandy's.
As long as Bill keeps the minutes, and reports it, who says we can't have a meeting off-site?
We only have 7 of us right here.
Yeah, the law says you can't do that. But you can email Chris with your individual questions or issues, and he'll make sure that I get those in case you all have any follow-up. And Chris and I will talk about next steps as far as process too. I'll make revisions. It might make sense to have another meeting with this body before we try to schedule something with the city. It would likely be a shorter meeting the next time around, but it might be most efficient to try to meet again before we try to go to the city council.
I was gonna ask this group if they think we should meet again, then what I was gonna try to do is get something on the, start trying to plan that, just so we have some other books to make that happen.
That's, yeah, that makes sense, Chris.
Probably wanna shoot for April then, maybe? Okay.
So Chris, anything else that you know that we should cover this evening?
I believe that's kind of everything we're planning on covering in this meeting. Just a quick reminder, we have commissioner training March 24th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. I know many of you have been doing this for a while, so you may not need to attend, but if you want to get brought up or just complete training again, there will be a meeting invite going out to everybody who is on all the commissions. As Mary said, if you have any questions, any additional comments, anything at all, just feel free to reach out to us. Thanks so much for staying here for one of the longer meetings I think you've had in a while.
All right, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
I'll move.
We have a second. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same
Aye.
sign. We are adjourned. Thank you very much for coming and helping us through this.